Morning, everybody. How are we? My name is Steve Dixon. I am the General Manager of Strategy and Partnerships at Toitū EnviroCare. Thanks for all coming along today. Looks like people are dribbling in. We're in the high 20s. We're expecting a few more. So I'll start with a slowish introduction to allow the sloths to make their way in. So we're here to talk about climate change risk and the TCFD, the ridiculously named Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And it's top of mind for lots of organisations because the government has more or less mandated a version of the TCFD for organisations. And so it's front of mind for both public sector and for many in the private sector at the moment. So today we have two speakers who are going to walk us through what does this mean and a little bit of background first from Barbara on what is the TCFD and how might you go about implementing it and what are the implications of it and so forth. Barbara will be well known to many of you. She's the CEO of Thinkstep Australasia. She's on the Climate Leaders Coalition board and has been working in this space for many, many years, more years than she'd like me to admit. So Barbara is a great find to help us through this process because she's already worked with a number of agencies and organisations in this area to help them with this. Following from Barbara, we'll have Olaf. Olaf Adam works for Westpac and has undertaken their TCFD work and works in their sustainability team. So he'll be able to talk to you about what it's really like to undertake one of these. What are the tricks? What are the tips? What have they learnt on your behalf to get to where they've got so far? And again, this is a bit of a treat because there aren't that many organisations in Aotearoa that have undertaken a TCFD all the way through yet. Because it's early, it's new, and it does have some complexities, and you have to be reasonably advanced in your understanding of your footprint and of climate risk to be able to work in this space. So Olaf will be sharing that following Barbara's initial presentation. Let me just share my slides. An indication, Kenzie, that people can see these would be good. Can someone indicate that they can see the slides, please, with a wave?
Nothing yet.
Nobody? Okay.
Nothing yet. Sorry, I was on mute.
Right.
Saying screen sharing. Yep, cool.
Lovely. All right. So as I was saying, so we'll get into the kind of the what and the how, and then we'll look more specifically at the insights that Westpac have gained. And then we'll have Q&A. So the way we'd like to run this is, look, this is a routine for so many of us now. We'll run this by you putting your questions into Q&A. We've muted you for very obvious reasons. And so your way in to ask your questions is to put them into the Q&A, and then I'll moderate those and direct them at the people who are most appropriate. Look, I've seen the list of registrants, and I know that on this list are a significant number of quite knowledgeable people. So we at Toitū don't believe that only the presenters and ourselves have the knowledge here. So look, where you have comments or thoughts or additions, please throw them in the Q&A, because it's always interesting to get other perspectives. So look, feel free if you have a different perspective or you have something to add, that you throw that in as well, and I'll make sure that people hear it. All right, so let's kick off with Barbara. I'll stop my sharing, Barbara, and you will step in.
Thank you very much, Steve. I will should be sharing my screen now. And you should be able to see my first slide. Again, if someone could indicate that that is the case. Cool. Thank you, Olaf. Well, thank you very much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be here, talk about TCFD, and I won't say the full name because every second time I won't get it out fully. let's just stick to TCFD, just for the record, climate-related financial disclosure. What we most of the time do is when we talk about climate and organizations, probably shouldn't put company here, but climate and organizations, most of the time we talk about the impact that we as an organization have on the climate. And that is the classic ESG reporting. What we do here is we look what impact does the climate potentially have in a financial way on our organizations. So it's just the other way around, or if you would like, it's completing the picture. Now, that is relatively new. So the task force has come up with recommendations. So it's not, it's always difficult to say you can comply with it because it's not a standard. It's 11 recommendations. And also they're very clear to say it's a process. You don't have to get it perfect right away. It's a process that should really start with a gap analysis and some qualitative reporting. And the two areas to start with really could be governance, as in whose task in the organization is it? What role does the board have in looking at those climate-related risks? What does management team have to do? So a real good description of the governance around it and risk management. And we'll focus a little bit more on risk management in the next few slides. The more challenging elements of TCFD reporting are around finding the right metrics. Because if we think metrics and climate, that's easy. These are our, well, easy, I say, our climate emissions. But what we're talking here is other financial metrics that could be impacted by climate. And they're a little more tricky to find. And then, of course, developing the strategy to manage those risks. Some risks are hidden and we don't really see them, but they could be quite big. We really have to look closely and be aware of where they might be. In TCFD, we differentiate between two types of risks. They are the physical risks. Could be a flood, could be a storm, could be severe weather events. And those can be immediate, high impact risks, but they can also be chronic risks. Physical risks can be chronic, as in generally areas will become drier. So we have both sides. We have transition risks, that is, market demands might change, which will have an impact on us. And there can also be opportunities. And we'll come to those a bit later as well. Now, how to get started to actually disclose those financial risks around those climate-related risks? It needs a team. And very often, this task lands with the sustainability champions in an organization. Now, do the sustainability champions really know all the numbers and how to quantify financial risks? Well, just talking for me, I probably wouldn't. But it still lands on the lap of sustainability people. And I think it's a good way because generally we are well connected into the organizations because we can't do our task on our own anyways. So we are aware of all the climate-related activities. That is one component, so tick. But we also connected throughout the business. We're connected to people in finance. We very often connect to people in sales. We have reached out. We understand what customers are looking for. If we have done materiality assessment, we know what investors are looking for. And we can just use all those frameworks and networks that we have and bring it all together. I just don't think the sustainability experts should be just given the task and expected to do it on their own. So the task force gives a few recommendations, and in their latest status report, what they said is just by getting started, focusing on governance and risk management, which is, I think, fairly straightforward for the governance side of things, needs a good description. With risk, we have to bear in mind that those climate-related risks are a bit different to the typical organizational risks, which are credit, operational, strategic type risks. Climate risks are all about location, 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 as in where are our assets? Are they exposed to weather events? Are they exposed to rising sea levels? And they can be very different in different geographies and depending on different activities. The next characteristic of those climate-related risks is that they are generally longer term and also long-lived. And they're not immediate. We have to have more foresight to anticipate those risks. That makes them a bit different to the typical organizational risks. They're also dynamic and there is hardly any precedence for them. So we are tapping in the dark a little bit. And they're possibly irreversible. And they're also interconnected with socioeconomic and financial systems. So they can be quite complex beast. But there are good examples on how organizations have dealt with them. One example is in the BHP Bulletin's climate change report. And they look at what is their risk strategy, what is their overall risk governance, and how it all loops back together. I won't go into detail here, but I've put the link on the page, so when the slides are circulated later, you can have a look at it. And we were lucky enough to have Fiona Wild, who's Vice President BHP for climate change and sits on the task force. She shared some of her findings in a webinar with us recently. And what she said is, just have a go at it and beg, borrow, and steal. And I think that's really good advice from her, to just have a look at what others are doing. Don't try and reinvent the wheel. And there are lots of really good reports out there. TCFD have a whole knowledge hub with excellent resources as well. And I've put links into those later on as well. Some of those risks are a bit obvious, and we have an idea on how we might be able to contain them. I don't think we can necessarily completely stop them. And other risks, we just don't know what might happen. It's a bit like the butterfly effect. We don't know what will tip it off because it's so complex and they're all interlinked. But also those climate risks really are a multiplier. So what we need to do is to check the assumptions that we have for our organizations, because are these assumptions still valid when we think about those climate-related risks? If they are not, then we really have to test them very seriously, because those assumptions form that map in our heads. And you know, it has happened that maps are wrong. We know now that the Banks Peninsula actually is a peninsula, not an island. We also know that Stewart Island is an island, not a peninsula. So they actually did get it wrong in the first place. So we'll have to go back and really revise those assumptions, because if we have the map wrong in our head, our action plans will go in the wrong direction. And once we have the action plans, our mental map drawn, it's really hard to change that. So testing assumptions is quite important, but also because of the multiplier effect, we need to see climate change. Let's say that change in the middle is climate change. It will have direct impacts, but those will have further impacts and might have further impacts down the supply chain. So it's really understanding the complexity, and by drawing it up like in this implications wheel, we're able to get a bigger picture of it. I was at a life cycle assessment conference last week, and one of the presenters said, we're using our LCA study to inform our TCFD report. And we're like, well, that's interesting. And she said, well, it's because looking at the full life cycle of our product, we actually really understand the full supply chain. We know all our suppliers, the feed for our animals, we're in the primary sector, and we get a much better understanding which of those suppliers might actually be impacted by climate risk because we have a global supply chain. So that can also be a good start. It's just generally having that system thinking. Next is then to start improving disclosure, and that is where the financial impacts and the metrics will come in. While ideally they're all quantified, it is not necessarily possible to do that. So starting with qualitative indications of what those impacts could be is really a good start. You can start with ranges, and again, learn from peers. Check in with the investors, what is relevant for them. And then some examples of organizations who have actually found financial metrics related to climate risk is an example from the UK. What they have done here is they've put in their savings from investments in low carbon equipment and products. They've got the percentage of rental income from Green Star rated buildings. In the UK, it's not Green Star, it's BREEAM, but same thing, really. Avoided energy consumption and costs. So for them, it's a lot of opportunities as well. But these are directly climate-related financial metrics. So when we bear in mind, when we talk metrics and TCFD, we are not only talking about what is the footprint, but other related metrics. A more local example is from Meridian, who have quantified the opportunities, because we will need more electricity, we will need more renewable electricity, and that can be quantified. And again, that has to do with TCFD, because it's not only the risks, it's also opportunities. Sort of the third stage is then to plan forward, to bring in the strategy. Once we know what our governance around it is, we have a handle on what the risks are, we've started identifying some of those metrics, now we need to think, well, how do we deal with those? And that, again, is quite difficult because we just simply cannot predict the future. But we can prepare for what we do when or if it happens. So we'll just have to build scenarios. We really have to do a lot of scenario analysis, look at financial scenarios, but also market scenarios that would be implemented, and also what could the future organization that we are in look like. And an approach that we use for having that future vision of the business in mind is a 3 horizons approach, as in what are our current challenges and what are the future challenges? What are our actions to get from one to the other? And to really then outline the bridges between the two. And that is how you could, for example, develop a strategy around it. So those 3 horizons, again, the first one is our current assumptions. Again, this assumption testing comes in. Then we should really look at the third one. What are the emerging paradigms? What might it look like in future? And then will come, how do we get there with adjustments over time? Most importantly, remember that the first TCFD disclosure doesn't have to be perfect. It's most important to get started, and there is the option to not comply, but to explain. And I think that really is one of the key things to remember. Don't try and get it perfect. And also, it doesn't have to be a standalone TCFD report. The task force actually recommends including it in the general annual report. They have put out lots of guidance documents. There is the TCFD Hub. There is a knowledge hub, which is learn.tcfdhub.org, and all those links will be on the slides. If you have further questions for me, quite happy to take them now or at the end, or just reach out to me. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Barbara. As ever, very thorough. Hey, look, there are no questions as yet, as people mull over things, and perhaps slightly stunned at the implications of some of the things that they'll need to do. But just remind me, so the government made some kind of provided a directive at the end of last year around some requirements for certain sorts of organisations to make climate-related risk disclosure. Can you just remind me who's captured by that and what the timeframes are for them?
Yeah, so the first disclosures are expected to come out in 2023. It is listed companies, it's financial institutions. I don't have it, over 200 billion.
The utilities are captured, I think, as well, and some government organisations.
Yeah.
I remember it being a tiny bit vague at the time, but hopefully they've tightened it up. All right. Hey, look, while people are mulling over questions, let's move on to Olaf, and he can give us a sense of what it's like to run a process through such as TCFD. Olaf, I'll hand over to you.
Yep. Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Ko Olaf toko ingoa, no tamaki me koutou aho, ke Westpac aho e Mahiana. Tēnā koutou katoa. I work in Westpac's sustainability team, and my area of focus in recent years has been climate change and, to be more precise, climate risk. So as Westpac, as an organization, we've long believed that climate risk is a financial risk. So the idea of climate-related financial disclosure came quite natural to us. In fact, Westpac New Zealand published its first climate change impact report in 2018, and while that wasn't TCFD aligned, but it did make some very critical observations around transition risk and how New Zealand could transition towards a low carbon economy. So more recently, we did become New Zealand's first bank to disclose our exposure to climate-related risks in line with the recommendations of the TCFD, and that's our 2020 climate risk report, which does sit on the bank's website next to the annual disclosure statement. So we did make an effort to visibly make this part of our mainstream financial disclosures. So really, that report is really our first line in the sand, and it very much outlines the wider impacts of sea level rise, and in particular on coastal properties, and how this will affect the banks. But obviously, we've also went through those 4 key areas that Barbara outlined so beautifully, and you can see this when you read the report, and you will find a lot of comments that Barbara made. You will see them in the report as well. As a bank, we are a huge advocate for climate risk disclosure. So not only did it help us to better understand our own risks, but we also really want our customers to understand their risks. We're a bank, risk is what we do. And as a bank, we're not just a producer, we are indeed a consumer of that kind of information. So very, very keen on TCFD disclosures become the norm in New Zealand, and also therefore very grateful for this opportunity provided by Toitu to share our experience with you, and thank you again, Stephen and the team to bring us here together today. So what I will do over the next couple of sort of 10 minutes or so, I will give you a bit of a behind the scenes tour of our disclosure report, which is just 10 pages, so it's not particularly massive, and you can find it on our website if you go there. But I'll give you a little bit of background and walk you through some of the key themes and sort of highlight the more interesting bits. So let's just keep rolling on that. So let's start with governance. Barbara, you talked about governance in your presentation. Really for us, the governance side is very much making use of our existing risk governance structure. And I emphasize here the risk governance structure, not the sustainability governance structure. And we really make use of the way we already look at ESG risks more broadly and the way we lend money, and we make use of how we look at sustainability risk more broadly. Remember, sustainability risk for a bank is basically about the things we do that create bad things for people or the environment. And so we actually had some existing frameworks that we could utilize. To Barbara's point, we didn't reinvent the wheel. We made use and adjusted the tools that we have available to us. And for time being, I think that is not a bad approach, although we all admit that climate risk will become more explicit in the way we deal with it, and will probably, and this structure that we have right now might not be in place forever, may expand over time. But this is the second part, and I think this is where it gets really interesting. You talked about maps. Here's one. We did a scenario analysis, and we very much focused on coastal hazards. The reason we did that is not because we think this is the only climate risk that New Zealand faces. We did this because as a starting point, we asked ourselves, what is probably a relevant risk for us as a bank, given what we do, as in lending money to properties? Also, where do we actually have the tools, and where do we have the ingredients to come up with something sensible and meaningful? And so having an understanding what kind of data is, or credible and sensible data is actually available at this point in time, was a key driver of that. Thirdly, and that's also very important, and again, I sort of reflect on that picture of the many dots that connect. You really need to understand how a natural hazard does turn into financial risk. So you need to have some sort of transition mechanism between the natural hazard and the financial impact. And for us, in the instance of sea level rise and flooding, you have this beautiful transmission mechanism called insurance, and that really turns it from that natural hazard into a financial risk. So we had this transition pathway as well. So those three things gave us something to have a crack at. And recognizing that we're all very much on a research and development journey, you don't want to start with the hardest. You want to start with something that kind of intuitively makes sense, where you've got something to play with, and you're just going to run with that. So the logical flow that we used is we got NIWA to cut us some customized data. In terms of, that is in simple terms, the risk to New Zealand. We asked ourselves then, through some fancy matching processes, how we are exposed to that risk and to what degree. And then we worked through a process to understand what the key risk factors are that make a difference to us as a bank. So the idea really was to move from risk, exposure to risk, factors that determine the risk, to exposure at risk. So just to differentiate between exposure to risk and exposure at risk, exposure to risk is, what is the touch point to that risk, and how big is it? How big is the connection? And then how big are the strains and the impacts that could occur on that connection, on that exposure? In our terms, it's how much money have we lent to areas that are potentially at risk from sea level rise and associated coastal flooding and erosion, and then trying to work out how much of that is actually potentially at risk from losses, which in banking terms, and Susan will know that, is usually is expressed in credit terms as an expected loss as a function of probability of default, i.e. can people afford to service their loans, and loss given default, i.e. if they can't service, what security do we have? So we used some existing structures, being our credit risk framework, but then added on some new things that we hadn't really had before. The real challenge that we found, and you will find that statement in that document, there's a wide range of possible scenarios purely based on insurance and how the regulatory system could adapt. And those wide ranges, that wide range of uncertainty makes it really, really hard to, or in fact impossible to reliably and accurately estimate future financial risks to the bank in the terms that we would usually use. So that's something that may be a little bit disappointing for many, but in fact, what we actually got out of this is a lot more interesting. We may not be able to exactly pinpoint in convenient numbers what the quantifiable risk really is, but what we did get out of that process is we understand what makes a difference. And understanding what makes a difference to the system in relation to that risk helps us to articulate a more strategic response other than the kind of knee-jerk reaction that many people would intuitively expect a bank to do. So for us, it's really around continuing analyzing climate-related risks. Do more work, understand it better, because we understood, or through the process that we went through, we did get an understanding of what the limitations of the data are, how sensitive the assumptions can be, and how wide the range of possible outcomes is. And therefore, we realize more work is required. We need some better data. We need some better understanding. And we need to remove some of these massive uncertainties that are still inherent in the system at the moment. Again, we don't know yet how insurers will indeed behave. We can have a guess, but we don't know. Likewise, we don't really know at this point in time what sort of steps a regulator or a government or society as a whole can and will take to mitigate these natural risks that are inherent in the system. Both factors are very, very important for us. We identified that there is information imbalances in the system, and you would have read a lot of the commentary around, people keep buying these low-lying coastal properties and values keep going up, and people ignoring the climate risk, even though everybody is talking about it. And so that highlights an issue that I think is in the system, that a lot of people are still in a position to ignore some of these things. Or if they don't want to ignore it, they're finding it very, very hard and difficult to find reliable, consistent, and credible information that will enable them to make better decisions potentially. So information imbalances are a thing. And it's something that for us, in terms of our broader strategic response, we have to think about. We have a keen interest in the review of the RMA. So the Climate Change Adaptation Act that's been mooted and announced is an area of keen interest to us. Again, this is really about how will we as society respond to these risks that are there. And of course, as a last point, really, really strongly support of climate-related financial disclosures, and making them mandatory, I think, is a key point, because as Barbara will know, and many of us know, New Zealand is seriously lagging behind the rest of the world. So UK and Europe are leading. Australia, the Australian corporate sector, is somewhat behind the UK and Europe, and then New Zealand is quite a bit behind the Australian sector, the Australian corporate sector. So therefore, we have a lot to catch up. And I think making it a mandatory requirement, I think, may just be that catalyst that I think gets people going onto the journey. In the report, we do briefly touch on the work we're doing on the sustainability side under the flag of corporate social responsibility. However, I want to very much highlight and emphasize what we're doing on climate risk is quite different from the traditional work that most sustainability teams do, which is about enhancing our impact, our environmental and social impact on society. There is a link between the two, and there are synergies, but fundamentally there are two different things. So to Barbara's point early, a lot of this stuff, climate risk entering many organizations through the sustainability teams, that is a very important observation. However, what is critically important is getting those geese together and creating a team that takes it beyond the remit, the mandate, and the capabilities of a sustainability team. In terms of risk management, it's certainly an area that, it kind of follows from a logical flow. I guess some would argue it kind of follows, the governance, who you get involved, who makes decisions, to strategy, how do you find out what the problem is, to, what are you going to do about it? So that's really where risk management comes into play. And again, here you see those two types of climate risk: physical risks and transition risk. And to be perfectly honest, this is by nowhere near a highly sophisticated or of comprehensive and fully fledged approach. Like everybody else, I think we are very much at the beginning of the journey, and so there is certainly recognition that this is an area that requires a lot of focus for us. But there are things we can do. We can, on the physical side, we can do the kind of work that we've done for our scenario analysis, and we can progress those various pieces of strategic actions to help address the key risk factors. And we can also gradually seek to incorporate these kinds of insights into the way we make decisions on a day-to-day basis in the context of a bank that's obviously how and when and to who and under what conditions we lend money. On the transition risk side, and again, it wasn't such a major focus of our report this time around, but what you can do is you can look at your overall portfolio as a bank and think about ways how you could shift that portfolio. Now, we haven't got a full view of, for example, the emissions intensity of our lending book, because that's very, very difficult to do. And Barbara will know in New Zealand that's particularly difficult because we haven't got that rich data. But that shouldn't stop us from intuitively start doing the right things. So from a Westpac perspective, coal is out and clean tech is in. And we make a particularly strong effort on increasing our sustainable finance lending activities, and by default, gradually shifting the shape of a portfolio to make it more aligned with what a 1.5 degree world might look like, and also at the same time reduce our exposure to those types of risks. Again, recognizing that in it is also an opportunity. So sustainable finance, we have stood up, I think we were the first New Zealand bank that had a dedicated sustainable finance team on the ground in New Zealand. So we've recognized that that is a key area that we need to focus on and taken some tangible steps to address those. Key metrics and targets. Again, this is not a comprehensive table as Barbara has shown us, that example from the UK property company, I presume, but it is a start. And here you see we start looking at our emissions, and it is actually a source of risk for us if it, it's social license to operate potentially. And look, here we are carbon zero, thanks to the great cooperation with Toitu. And here that chart on the right-hand side, that line is it's not a perfect measure, but it is a good, strong proxy that demonstrates the efforts we are undertaking as an organization to change the shape of our book to future-proof it. So fossil fuel mining and production as a proxy of lending to brown has been reducing for some time. And we have made significant increases over time to lend for more sustainable purposes. And that black line is hopefully going to go up a bit faster. And the red line has probably sort of reached a level where it probably won't drop much faster any further, because we have to concern ourselves with transition fuels and the likes. But it does demonstrate a direction of travel that we have taken as a bank. To the interesting bits, what have we learned? It's been about an 18 months process. And again, 10 pages output from 18 months of work, that might not sound particularly impressive, but this actually hasn't been all about ticking the box and putting a report out. This has really genuinely been about understanding a wicked problem, a complex risk with lots of interacting factors and different rabbit holes you can easily go down to, and trying to really connect that into a language that is relevant for the bank. So, and really what that has meant for us is the more you put in, the more you allow yourself to explore and investigate and allow yourself to go down the old rabbit hole, the more you're actually going to get out of it. So perhaps less relevant from well, it is relevant from the public sector, absolutely. But in my conversations with some of our corporate customers, my urge to them is always, don't just treat this as a compliance exercise. Use this as a real opportunity to understand your business better. And I love that example that you made before, Barbara, about the life cycle. Great example of somebody actually going, yeah, this is what we do, and we're just going to kind of incorporate thinking about climate change into that way and really analyze and understand our business. And that's a really, really great and strong and powerful story. Allow yourself to treat it as a research and development project with a bit of a license to explore and at times fail. Find the right balance between external expertise and internal contributions. So bringing in expertise that you don't have in-house is good, but making sure you transfer that knowledge and understanding and contribute with your own understanding of your own organizations is critically important. So a full 100% outsource might not give you the benefits that you're seeking. And I think the last point, really, really important, start somewhere. I can absolutely agree with Barbara on that. You've got to give it a go, and you've got to give it a start. And even if it's not perfect, and ours most certainly isn't, you've got to get on the journey. The sooner you do that, the better. So we keep going. We've formalized our climate risk program of work a bit more than we perhaps had at the beginning. We're focusing on particular sectors at the moment. Agri is one of them. We're engaging heavily with industries, we're engaging with customers on the topic, and we're engaging with stakeholders. And we're also really focusing more on how we can actually improve our risk, the way we manage these risks now and in the future. We're engaged in we're really interested in the RMA review, and obviously also really engaged in the Climate Change Commission's advice. So again, at the start of the journey, but it's worth it. I very much encourage you to have a read of our document. 10 pages. Some of the stuff is really interesting, some of it is boring, but it's easy to find. We've put it on our website. You scroll down to the section that says disclosure statements, and there it is next to our formal disclosure statement. Click on it, and there is a beautiful 10-page, well-designed PDF that tells you a lot of the things you need to know. And obviously, we are a bank, but we are open to help, to support where we can, in particular for our customers, which includes central government. We're more than happy to, assist where we can, because it benefits us as well. So please reach out. And, yeah, kia ora.
Kia ora, Olaf. Thank you very much. Really interesting insight into the process you undertook. Now, we've got 13 minutes before people will start to log off. So a number of questions have come in already. I'll start at the top with you, Peter Longdell. Now, Olaf, you've already indicated that it took you 18 months to undertake this process. But Barbara, do you have a sense of what timeline would be appropriate for an organisation to go through this TCFD process? You need to unmute yourself. There you go.
I would look at it as a sort of, one option of looking at it as a two-stage approach, to really start with an initial disclosure, which could be done within the first year. And I would think somewhere between 6 and 10 months to have that first qualitative aspect done, to do the gap analysis, to better understand what the risks are, to then move for the second year in the disclosure to identify what could some of those financial metrics be, and to start quantifying those in more detail. So you could also, I guess Olaf answered the question as in how long it took and what the approach is. You can obviously also just do more preparation work and then have a report that covers all areas in a lot of detail, like the Westpac report. Yeah, I think it's
okay. So as you've been indicating already, it's a journey, right? So you will not complete it all in one go. So you make a start, but as it's a journey, it's probably not going to end for a little while. What about resourcing? I mean, what sort of resourcing, Olaf, did you require to get this work done?
So we brought in some external expertise around climate change. That was effectively a lot of it had to do with the data which we obtained, which we customized and obtained from NIWA, and we brought in some additional resource in the form of one consultant for a couple of months that kind of just helped us to grind through this and sort of have someone who's fully dedicated to this piece of work. There were about 2 people that, not full-time, but were fully, 2 or 3 people that were at least part-time dedicated to this mahi. But there was a large group of internal contributors, people that we've just engaged on particular questions and topics. And every time you obviously spend a lot of time sort of engaging with them and educating them in the process. There is no right or wrong answers here. Is that it's not a matter how long it will take. You can do this in 2 weeks if you like, but you're not going to get the benefits if that's your pathway. Or you can do it a bit more and get a better understanding of your organization. So for us, we went for a little bit more than most people would, but I think we also got the benefits out of it.
Okay, great, thank you. A question from Anonymous. Do you think the Global Reporting Initiative is a good solution for TCFD? Either of you?
Elements of it. I think the Global Reporting Initiative really focuses more on what is our impact on the environment, not so much the other way around. So I think integrated reporting is possibly more closely aligned because it also has a very strong investor focus. But the elements of GRI where they provide guidance on how to describe the governance around sustainability could possibly be a good starting point. But I would probably stick with the actual recommendations of the TCFD, and they've got really good guidance documents specifically for TCFD reporting.
Okay, great. Thank you. What assurance, Jonathan is asking, what assurance is provided over climate-related financial reporting? Starting with you, Olaf, did you have any assurance over your TCFD report?
Not formally, and I think there's a general understanding that because the standards aren't prescribed, it is very hard to formally provide assurance. What I did have, we had someone to independently provide me with peer review of what I was doing, reviewing early drafts, having a bit of a sight, having a more insight into the project itself, and then providing me with an opinion whether she thought we are hitting the mark or we weren't. And so that gave me an insight in the areas we need to improve going forward. And that was certainly useful, but it's certainly not independent assurance, but I describe it as a peer review and general advice.
Barbara, any additional thoughts?
No, not really.
Okay, now Anonymous has also thanked you, Olaf, firstly, but then noted that the Climate Change Commission's draft advice has pointed out that we should evaluate the potential of mandatory disclosure by financial institutions of the emissions enabled by loans over a specified threshold. Do you have any comment on that? I
absolutely agree with. I agree with the recommendation of the Climate Change Commission. It is very challenging though, because we just haven't got certain things in place here in New Zealand that other countries have. So, for example, we haven't got a mandatory system that rates the energy efficiency of a house, which is very common in Europe and in the UK. So that would give you an ability to look at the emissions intensity of your residential mortgage portfolio. We just simply haven't got that. So we need to find a way of creating proxies that might do this to us. Similarly, until we, for example, have a full disclosure of the emissions of every single company, that will make it very difficult for us to understand the emissions intensity of our corporate lending. Again, you can use proxies in the interim. So there's certainly ways of doing it, but it's not going to be necessarily accurate. But I think it would be very, very good if banks started thinking along those lines. So yeah, we certainly do. But it's not as clean and as beautiful and as clean cut as some of the European counterparts can do it. So yeah, and it takes more work for us, to be honest.
Okay. For those who are interested, Toitu has a webinar coming up on the climate the CCC, the Climate Commission's, the Climate Change Commission's recent draft advice. So if you're interested in a wider perspective on how we see that advice and what we think the implications are, look us up on our website and you'll see when that webinar is coming up. I want to drop down to Chris Thurston's question now, which is about the public sector specifically. Have either of you seen examples of public sector reporting under the TCFD?
Not specifically. I would have to have another look, but there is not one that just
do you see any pros and cons for the public sector of using this approach? Is it harder or easier or relevant for the public sector? I mean, clearly it's relevant because the government's just made it relevant. But any thoughts there as to its applicability to the public sector?
Well, from my perspective, it's you know, the TCFD is the I can't describe it as the universally understood language of climate risk disclosure. So I think by default, it's a good place to start. Is it relevant? Absolutely. And again, this is not just about the emissions intensity of you know, your own emissions as an organization, but it is really about understanding, for example, the legal risks that you may be facing. You know, I'm thinking of a local council here and the Jack Hodder opinion. You know, so I think it's certainly, and the TCFD allows to think in those terms. So I think it is a good starting point. Hope that answers the question, Chris.
I think, as with many other frameworks, yes, it is about disclosure, and disclosure is external, but it helps inform resilience for the internal planning. And I guess having resilience in the planning is quite crucial for any organization. So it's possibly just good practice for any organization to think along the lines. And some aspects might be more relevant to public organizations, and some of the recommendations might be less relevant, but the overall outcome, I mean, there is a reason that it should be done, and that is to also increase resilience. And I think we should keep that in mind as well. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Suze Keith has a question. She's from Greater Wellington Council, and this is something of a doozy, right? So she's pointing out quite accurately that there's a heck of a lot of unknowns, cascading effects, and uncertainty in the space of climate change and climate change risk. But particularly if you look at a council when they have to operate within the four well-beings, and the government obviously has an interest in this space now, how do you think you can use the TCFD framework to help capture some of these less quantifiable impacts? You know, so we're talking social risks as well as pure physical and natural risks, and financial, obviously.
I mean, I'll have a start first. So kia ora, Susie. Obviously, I appreciate that. Yeah, that you're on probably one of the most challenging environments when it comes to climate risk for a number of reasons, and I've hinted at the Jack Hodder opinion, so that's one of them. I would just kind of take the TCFD framework, park it on the side, take the financial bit out of the climate-related financial risk, and just say risks, bad things that might happen because of climate change, and how does it affect us as an organization. And just think about it in those terms. When you start thinking about it, you kind of think, yeah, who does what in the zoo, and how and when? That's your governance, and how can we find out more, and what could go wrong? So you kind of find that ultimately you kind of default back to the TCFD framework, and I think that's one of the wonderful things. So just take the financial bit out of the title and just go, what risks do I face? What's important to me? And when it comes to the disclosure, you may decide, well, I'm just going to specifically disclose on the financial aspects of it. But obviously, these are interconnected, right? Social risks for a council are financial risks in some shape or form. So you can't disconnect the two from each other. So don't think about it too much into those silos, and just kind of go, what could go wrong as a result of climate change? Let's just start thinking about it in those terms. Not sure that helps, but
yeah, I agree. It's about identifying generally what are potential risks, and sort of what could be the consequences, and having it qualitatively to start with is absolutely fine. I don't think we really need to quantify them all, and I think it's also not necessarily anticipating all of them, but be prepared if they happen, what could we do? So I don't think you also need a plan for every possible risk, but you can sort of start ranking them in their likelihood somewhat, but keep all of them in mind.
Look, the government's already having a go at trying to undertake some wellbeing measurements through its own budgeting. So I'd definitely look at the Treasury website for its wellbeing measures, which are beginning to attempt to capture some of these. Sadly, they're weakest in the environment space, but my sense is that Greater Wellington and councils are probably strongest there. So they have actually done some work on the wellbeings in the social space, so it's worth having a look there. Look, we're running out of time. What I'll suggest to yourself, Peter, and Jeff, with your additional questions, is that we'll answer those in the comments, so you get a response to those. And I'd just like to finish off by saying thank you, Olaf, and thank you, Barbara, so much for contributing your expertise and your experience today. And thank you, 50 odd of you who've been online for nearly the entire time. So it's always a good sign in a Zoom when we have next to no drop-offs. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your really interesting questions and thought-provoking questions. As I say, we have a webinar coming up at Toitu on the Climate Change Commission's report and the implications of that. So go and look up that and log on and register if you're interested. And yes, thank you again, Barbara and Olaf, and I'll say goodbye for now. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.